Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this virtual Balliol Younger Society annual dinner. I can only presume it will be a less raucous affair than is usual for most of you attending this evening, but if anyone feels the need to throw bread rolls at their screen to make the experience a little more authentic, then please do feel free. For my part, I much prefer a stage to a desk, but the advantage of the current format, I suppose, is at least that there is a comforting explanation for the absence of audible mirth following my jokes. I should also make it very clear that anything and everything I say tonight is attributable wholly to me in my personal capacity and not to the Law Commission of England and Wales, my current employer. I can therefore blame nobody but myself if it is poorly received, or worse, gives rise to any difficult questions, although I will do my very best to answer those later on. But just before I begin, so that you have some idea when to go and fill your glasses, I will say at the outset that I am going to say a little bit about law, perhaps unsurprisingly, a bit about technology, since that's one of my main focuses at the moment, or at least the interaction of law and technology, probably something about chess, and definitely something about Balliol. I am not going to mention the C word once. I will try and mark this out roughly in that way, although I should say that I am to any kind of script what 2020 has been to a full social calendar. So we'll see how it goes. But I will start off then with the law and technology stuff. This is the main focus of what I'm doing at the Law Commission. And I think it's probably something that needs to be talked about in legal circles a bit more. And also has the advantage, if I deal with it now, it is probably the heavier part of the talk. At least at this point, everyone is probably more or less at the peak of their interest and concentration. So my team at the Law Commission is currently working on law reform in relation to digitised assets, electronic documents and smart contracts. And digitised assets are very difficult to define, or maybe contentious to define category. I was at a meeting yesterday with the Uniform Commercial Code body, and there was hours of argument about what we mean by digitised assets. But for the purposes of this evening, it's quite easy to define in that it's really quite broad. There's two parts to it. So first, I'm referring to digitised versions of existing things, so things that we already know about and are familiar with, but which also now exist in electronic form. So, for instance, virtual currencies, cryptocurrencies, electronic bills of lading, things like that. But it also encompasses, and I'm also dealing with, or the Law Commission is also dealing with, entirely new phenomena with which the law is not familiar. Such as tokens recorded in software, computer software, that are tethered to real world assets and represent those assets in the real world. And those assets that they represent can be anything from, and are everything from bars of gold to T-bone steaks. And basically, these tokens facilitate the efficient and transparent dealing with those goods in all sorts of ways, from supply chain management to transfer and sale. So, for instance, in terms of supply chain with food, what those tokens essentially enable purchasers to do is to trace the provenance of what it is they're buying. So essentially, the progress of the token, or the movement of the token, mirrors to some extent the journey of the asset in the real world. And that's something that we're probably not entirely familiar with, but is I think, pretty definite part of our very near future. So that's just a few words really about what I mean by digitised assets, just to give you some clue about that. So what we're doing at the Law Commission is considering what law reform is necessary in order to accommodate these things that are already being used to a greater or lesser degree, and certainly I think are going to be used a lot more in the future, certainly in the medium term. And essentially what that means is that we are grappling with the irresistible force of technological development, having met the immovable object of the common law's definition of a thing in possession. So for those who can't remember, never knew, or didn't think they cared, the classification of something as a thing in possession in the law of England and Wales is a big deal. It means, for one thing, that one's proprietary interests in the thing in question receive the full force of the common law's protection. So if you can possess it, it is protected to the maximum extent possible. It also means that the thing in question can be transferred efficiently and completely to another, and that one can divest oneself completely of it. Now, these things are obviously possible in relation to a cow, and not possible in relation to, say, an idea or an item of pure information. With an idea or pure information, obviously, you can't divest yourself of it. I could tell you my idea, but I can't get rid of it from my own mind. Maybe that sometimes happens, but generally, that's not what is available to me. And on this, most reasonable people can agree. So that is a dichotomy that doesn't tend to generate, insofar as that goes, very much debate. When we ask, however, as we do in the digital age, whether the same things are possible in relation to, say, a bespoke private software database or a bill of lading that is in electronic form, the fur starts to fly. In short, according to current common law definitions, the latter two phenomena, so the software database and the electronic bill of lading, are deemed not to be amenable to possession. So they're not things in possession. And this leaves them as a matter of conceptual organisation in the category of things in action, and leaves those who hold them, as a matter of fact, with legal protection falling far short of what in most cases they would expect. Now, this comes as a surprise to lots of people, certainly students who have known very little else but a world in which most of their personal property is electronic or digitised in form. It's a real surprise to them to learn that it doesn't necessarily attract the same sort of proprietary protection as the non-electronic things that they own. Now, the problem with calling digitised assets or saying that digitised assets belong to the things in action category is that they're not. They've been placed in this category really as a residual consequence, and this has been confirmed by the legal statement issued by the UK Jurisdiction Task Force last year, and I'll come back to this in a minute. That's a problem, and I'll come back to that. And the practical problem, so that's the conceptual problem. The practical problem is that we are now therefore in a reality in which I can recover the value of my computer hardware should somebody deprive me of it, but not, or at least not as easily and on a comparable strict liability basis, not recover the value of my bespoke software database should someone choose instead to deprive me of just that. And not only does this belie the fact that the value of the latter, so the value of the software, will in many cases dwarf the value of the hardware, but it also defeats the legitimate expectations of those parties who have invested resources in their digital assets. And of course, as we all know, the resources that are invested in digital assets are huge as a proportion of total resources in a commercial sense, and ever increasing. And the same situation, so this refusal for the common law to extend a definition of possession, or amenability to possession, I should say, to electronic things, is that documents of title carry title on a transfer between parties, but only so long as they are in a paper as opposed to an electronic form. And sadly, of course, this is not the form which most commercial parties any longer want to deal in. So it doesn't match, so the legal expectations or the legal effect does not really match the practical reality of how parties deal with one another. So how did we get here? As I said, particularly to young lawyers and students, this tends to be quite a surprising position that we find ourselves in. But actually the reason for it is very easy to state, even if it is fiendishly difficult to rectify. And the reason that we're in this position is because the common law, and again, this is something that younger generations are probably less likely to do, but it's because the common law continues to elide the concepts of tangibility and possession, and to use the former, tangibility, as a touchstone for identifying where the latter is possible. If something is tangible, it can be possessed. If it is intangible, it cannot be possessed. Therefore, it's not a thing in possession, and it doesn't attract the same protections and effects of the law. Now, historically, this made sense as a matter of factual association, and tangibility has long been an incidental description of what can be possessed. But of course, it's not causative of that fact. As long as people wanted protection for their cattle, their gold, their coins, and their machinery, there was no distinction to be made between tangibility and possession, because movables had corporeal form. But this association simply does not hold in the digital age. Economic and commercial changes come and go, but still the common law remains a cockroach. Innovations and technological developments of seismic proportions are occurring all around us, but the common law has thus far refused to bend. If I cannot see it and touch it, apparently I cannot possess it. Imagine a village where two crops are grown. One is edible and displays a blue flower. The other is inedible and displays a red flower. After many years of the villagers recognising this distinction, an exotic bird deposits the seed of a new plant in the village, which when it grows, the villagers discover is edible. But it displays a green flower, so they do not eat it, even when it starts to choke the growth of the edible blue flower plant. In this allegory, the blue colour of the flower is, of course, analogous to tangibility. Edible things have blue flowers, but the blue flower is not what makes them edible. The blue flower is historically associated with the edible nature of the plant, but is not causative of it. I don't need to tell this audience that the law of England and Wales is something of which we are and should be enormously proud. It is preeminent in a global sense, and rightly so. Partly, this is as a result of its cockroach tendencies, particularly in commercial law terms. Parties want to know that the nature and extent of their rights and obligations are not going to change with the wind. Despite the frustration that is probably quite obvious in some of my words tonight, I do love our law, but I feel towards it rather like one does towards a stubborn and spirited child. In an increasingly digital and global marketplace, and dare I say it, in a post-Brexit era, there is a need to adapt and to update. After all, as Milsom said, the law is a creature of exigency rather than design. I, as in me, I can't blame Milsom for this bit, see no reason why the law should be the servant of its own categories. In conversations about the reforms to be proposed by the Law Commission, I've been met on several occasions with the objection that change is perhaps not necessary because, amongst other things, Roman law survived perfectly well and it had no classificatory space between bare rights and corporeal things, which is really, I suppose, where you could say digitised assets sit. For my part, I think it was highly short-sighted and self-absorbed of that pesky Justinian not to tell us what to do about Bitcoin. I knew he would never amount to much. I have no doubt that our legal forebears, particularly those as progressive and inventive as those in Rome, will be watching us with barely concealed avuncular pride if we ever make our first tentative steps from the established and the familiar towards the new, the unknown, and the inevitable. I can, of course, possess a gold coin by holding it or putting it in my pocket, but I can perfectly analogously possess a hashed token of the type I referred to earlier, or an electronic bill of lading, when the software allows me to control it, to exclude others from it, and to divest myself completely of it. A recognition of this would be one small step for law and one giant leap for mankind, for sure. It was Rilke who said that the purpose of life is to be defeated by larger and larger things. This, in my view, is also the purpose of legal categories, but not of the law itself. I should say, by the way, on the point about software and what it allows us to do, there are many initiatives ongoing at the moment by technologists developing software for the very purpose and with the avowed aim of achieving exclusion and divestibility for the digitized assets to which it applies. It is, of course, true when we think about law and the age of that as an institution, that it might be unsurprising to us that it hasn't changed particularly quickly. There are other institutions that are as certainly as old and maybe in some people's eyes as venerable as law, which have, maybe surprisingly, managed to adapt to the profound technological shifts in the world around us and recognized what is coming. One of those is chess. And I think it's true to say that chess was played the same way for thousands and thousands of years until computers fancied a game. Now, Magnus Carlsen, who's several times world chess champion across several formats, attributes his most recent victories to wrong-footing his opponents by making explicitly non-tactical moves, deliberate mistakes, if you will. And why does he do that? Because against opponents who now train, as they do, almost exclusively against the brute force of artificial intelligence algorithms, those opponents are unused to encountering such non-tactical play. So this was a new, counterintuitive, perhaps an innovative route to success. It was, I suppose you could say, an example of artificial intelligence being defeated by real stupidity. It is obvious, perhaps, why the game of chess is such an attraction for AI technologists. Nobody has ever worked out, to my knowledge, the exact number of possible chess games. It's so huge, it is not currently worth the candle. I'll come on to why it might soon be worth a candle in a couple of minutes. But a rough estimate of what is involved has been worked out. Now take the IBM Summit supercomputer. It is a computer, a classical computer, that can perform 200 quadrillion calculations, that's 2 times 10 to the power of 17, per second. And if every atom in our galaxy, which is about 10 to the power of 67, were a Summit computer, and if each one of those computers had been working for every second since the Big Bang, and that's about 10 to the power of 18, they still wouldn't have finished assessing the possibilities of every single chess game. Now, these are all possibilities, and AI is, of course, designed and built to select the optimal possibilities. So Magnus Carlsen's workaround was effective. Otherwise, computers, even on what they can currently calculate, can defeat any human. But as Carlsen says, they are really good tactically, but they can't play chess. So chess changed, and I guess will continue to change in response to those technological developments. Now, even if we do get to grips with brute force classical computing, we are really doing no more than playing around in the foothills of what artificial intelligence has in store for us. On the distant but ever approaching horizon is the promise and the threat of quantum computing. Classical computers, as I'm sure you all know, manipulate and store data using binary switches, and those are just switches which can be in either an on 1 or an off 0 position. And everything that such computers do, from email to word processing to working with databases to playing music to filming people talking about quantum computing. All of that is basically just a reorganization of those two on and off positions. But in a quantum computer, the switches can be either on or off, or on and off at the same time, thereby giving three possibilities. So one switch can store numbers 0 and 1 simultaneously instead of alternatively. These switches are called qubits, spelled with a Q. The implications of this are hard for a human brain to compute. Well, they're certainly hard for mine anyway, but I do enjoy trying. To give you an example, say we are trying to store the numbers 0 to 3. A classical computer would require 4 pairs of classical bits to do this. But a quantum machine, using the same 8 qubits, can represent not 4, 2 to the power of 2, but 256, 2 to the power of 8, simultaneously. And any manipulation of any one of those numbers is effectively carried out in 256 universes at the same time, as if 256 classical computers were devoted to each calculation. So the numbers sound pretty impressive, but what do they mean? They mean that, amongst other things, the cryptography on which we currently rely for everything, for our commercial, personal, micro and macroeconomic, political and military security, will, when quantum computing takes hold, look like the virtual equivalent of a door with a broken lock and a huge person-shaped hole in it and a conveyor belt running through it. You get the picture. The calculations that I gave you earlier about the chess moves that would take classical computers longer than the age of the universe to compute would take a quantum computer in principle. It hasn't been built yet to this extent. But would take a quantum computer hundreds of minutes at most. So nobody is ready for quantum computing. And the law, which can hardly be expected to run before its subjects can walk, is certainly not. But we confuse the signals with the noise at our peril. So that was all pretty heavy stuff for a Saturday night. I'm going to talk a bit about this wonderful college of ours now for some light relief. I should say at this point, many congratulations to Grant LeMond for his 20-year contribution to the long history of Balliol and to its law legacy in particular. I enjoyed several years working alongside Grant when I was in Oxford, and it was a very enjoyable time. So congratulations again to Grant LeMond. Balliol, I think it goes without saying that I learned a lot at Balliol. First, and probably what's most relevant to what I've been saying tonight, I learnt not to accept that the way the law is the way it should stay. Imposing an ancient edifice though it is, it will, like one of those exotic tropical fish, die if it ever stops moving. In my very first tutorial, I remember looking up from giving what I thought was a majestic account of the law of offer and acceptance in contract. I was met not with the stunned countenance of enlightenment and awe that I was expecting, but instead an expression which said very eloquently, "So what?" Swiftly followed by words to the same effect. In those tutorials and others, deference to the status quo was neither welcomed nor celebrated, and for this I am grateful. My time at Balliol also taught me how to write something vaguely coherent in the middle of the night with less than ideal preparation, whilst in an advanced state of refreshment. That particular lesson has proved to be invaluable and one that I've called on time and time again. It was also pretty instructive in cocktail making. I remember many a shift behind the bar at Bops. In my final year, I'd become so confident in my abilities that I said to one lucky customer, I think his name was Reuben or Dan or Jack or something, that he should name any cocktail, and if I didn't know how to make it, he could have it for free. I was, of course, fully intending to reimburse the JCR from my own funds. Okay, he said, I like a Southampton. I racked my brains, as in the days before Google, this was the best I could do. But eventually, I had to admit defeat and I gave up. Southampton? What on earth is that? Oh, it's just a large port, he said. These are all invaluable takeaways, but I did earn them by engaging in lots and lots of serious, committed and unmitigated fun. Balliol's most important contribution to my existence, however, has been unquestionably the friends for life that I made there. I have learnt since that it is relatively unusual for such a large group of university contemporaries to stay so close. Perhaps it's because we know too much about each other to risk any severance of bonds, but I am grateful nonetheless that careers, foreign climes, moist and dry, children, and life choices have not, even in combination, operated to distance us. I hope those of you currently enjoying your studies at Balliol take with you through your lives as much as I have had the privilege to do. I look forward to your questions and your comments, which for you will be in a few minutes and for me will be in a few days. Thank you very much.